I've been wrestling with whether to share this, but it's been stuck in my mind, and maybe writing it down will help me process it. This isn't some made-up story. It happened just a few months back. I'm from Dayton, Ohio, and my two best friends, Ryan and Jake, have been close to me since high school. We did sports together, went to the same college, the whole deal. Back in April, Jake's father passed away suddenly from a heart attack, with no warning whatsoever. Jake was shattered. His dad was his biggest support, and losing him hit Jake harder than anything I'd ever seen. After the funeral, Jake was in a dark place, and Ryan and I did everything we could to lift his spirits, but nothing seemed to help. One evening, out of the blue, Jake called and suggested we all go camping like we used to. He said he needed to get away from the city and clear his mind. Ryan and I were on board, thinking some time in nature might be exactly what he needed. We chose to go to Hocking Hills State Park in southeastern Ohio, a huge forest area with dense trees and hardly any people. A perfect place to get away. Ryan had recently gotten a small camper. It wasn't fancy, but it had the basics. A couple of bunks, a tiny kitchen space, and best of all, a heater for the chilly nights. We packed our stuff on a Friday afternoon. Sleeping bags, hiking gear, a cooler full of snacks and drinks, and then hit the road. The drive was full of our usual banter, though Jake was quieter than usual. We didn't push him, just let him be. When we reached the park, we decided to find a spot off the main trails, somewhere secluded where we wouldn't be bothered. After navigating some rough dirt roads, we found a clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. It felt right, so we set up, started a fire, and spent the evening grilling burgers and reminiscing. The sky was clear, and the stars were shining bright. Ryan, who's always been into stargazing, was thrilled. "Look at that sky," he said, leaning back against a log. "You don't see that in the city." "Yeah, it's amazing," I agreed. Jake seemed to relax a bit, sipping his drink and even smiling now and then. It was good to see him unwind. Around midnight, Ryan got an idea. "I'm sleeping on the roof of the camper tonight," he announced. "I don't want to miss this view." Jake laughed. "You're crazy, man." "Maybe," Ryan grinned, "but I'll have the best view." I chuckled. "Just don't roll off in your sleep." He grabbed a sleeping bag and climbed up, getting comfortable on the flat roof. Jake and I decided to turn in and headed inside the camper. It was cozy, 2 small bunks and just enough room to stand. I climbed into my bunk and pulled out my phone, scrolling aimlessly through social media. Jake lay across from me, staring at the ceiling. "You doing okay?" I asked. He sighed. "Yeah, just thinking about my dad. He would have loved this." I nodded. "He was a good man." "Thanks," Jake said softly. Eventually, I started to drift off. Sometime later, I was awakened by a soft knocking. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then it came again, a gentle tap at the camper door. "Jake, did you hear that?" I whispered. He stirred. "Hear what?" "Someone's knocking." We both listened, and there it was, a faint, deliberate knock. "Maybe it's Ryan playing around," Jake suggested. Just then, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Ryan. "You guys awake?" "Yes," I replied. "Are you knocking on the door?" "Nope, but I see someone outside," he texted back. My heart skipped a beat. "Who?" "Looks like 2 kids standing near the fire pit." I showed Jake the text. He looked as puzzled as I felt. "What are kids doing out here at this hour?" he asked. "No clue," I replied. "Should we check it out?" He nodded. "We can't just ignore them." I called through the door. Hello? Can we help you?" A small voice replied, "Please, we need to use your phone." Something about the voice seemed off. It was flat, almost robotic. "Where are your parents?" Jake asked. "Please let us in," the voice said again. I felt a weird feeling in my stomach. "We can call someone for you," I replied, trying to sound calm. Silence. Then, "We need to come in. Let us in." My phone buzzed again. Another message from Ryan. "Don't let them in. Something's wrong." "What's going on?" I texted back. He replied, "Their eyes. They're totally black." A chill ran down my spine. I showed Jake the message. "What does that even mean?" he whispered. "I don't know, but Ryan sounds serious." The knocking got louder. "Let us in," the voices demanded, more insistent this time. "We'll help you find your parents," I said, trying to keep my composure. "No, you have to let us in," the voice insisted. "Why do you need an invitation?" Jake asked, a little unnerved. "Please, we just want to come in," the voice said again, almost pleading. My phone buzzed yet again. Ryan texted, "They're acting weird. They keep looking up here, but I don't think they can see me. Should we call the police?" I texted back. "Maybe, but we're pretty far out," he replied. Jake looked uneasy. "What do we do?" "Keep the door locked," I said firmly. The knocking stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then we heard footsteps moving around the camper. Slow, deliberate footsteps. "They're walking around," Jake whispered. We stayed quiet, listening to the soft crunch of leaves. The footsteps paused near one of the windows. "Please let us in," the voice said, just outside. I peered through the curtain but couldn't make out much, only a small figure by the window. "Why won't you let us in?" the voice asked, sounding almost desperate. I didn't know what to say, my mind racing. Then, from above, we heard a faint thud. Ryan messaged again. "They're trying to climb up here. Be careful." "Be careful," I replied. He texted. One of them said something weird. I swear it sounded like, "Your friends won't help you." I showed Jake the message. "This is getting creepy," he agreed. "Maybe we need to stick together." "Good idea," I nodded. We decided to bring Ryan inside. I gathered the nerve to open the door slightly and called, "Ryan, get down here." He quietly climbed down the ladder, and as he reached the ground, we heard one of the voices say, "You've made a mistake." We rushed inside and locked the door. "What's going on?" Jake asked. "I don't know," Ryan said, catching his breath. "But those kids, their eyes are pitch black, no whites, nothing." "That's impossible," I said, but Ryan insisted he saw it. We sat there, trying to process what was happening. "Maybe they're wearing contacts," Jake suggested. "At this hour, in the middle of nowhere?" Ryan replied. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You can't hide from us." I showed it to the others. "Did either of you give out your numbers?" They shook their heads. "How did they get it?" Jake wondered. The footsteps started again, this time moving faster around the camper. "This is messed up," Ryan said. "Should we call the police?" Jake asked. I tried dialing 911, but the call wouldn't connect. "No signal, I guess," I muttered. "Same here," Ryan said, checking his phone. "Great," Jake murmured. The voices came again, more frustrated this time. "This is your last chance. Let us in." "Ignore them," I whispered. We huddled together, hoping they'd leave. Minutes felt like hours. Then, everything went quiet. The footsteps, the voices, gone. "Do you think they left?" Jake asked. "Maybe," Ryan said, doubtful. I looked out the window but saw no one. "Let's just wait a bit longer to be sure." We sat there for another half hour, and when no sounds came, we started to relax a little. "Maybe it was some kind of prank," Jake suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "Who would go to this length?" Ryan asked. "Kids from town?" "I don't know. I'm not staying to find out," I said. "Let's pack up and get out of here." We gathered our things as quietly as we could and stepped outside. The woods were eerily still. The fire had died down to glowing embers. We loaded the camper, and just as we were about to leave, I heard it. A voice calling from the darkness. "Do you think you're leaving?" I spun around but saw nothing. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaky. "Silence. Let's go." One summer when I was 14, I stayed with family on the reservation. We lived in the city, but each summer, it was tradition to visit my relatives out in the forest. I always looked forward to this trip, mostly because of my cousins. Ethan, who was 15, Lily, my age, and Kyle, who was 12. Their home was deep in the woods, surrounded by tall trees and the sounds of nature. A world apart from my life back home. One evening after supper, the four of us sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the trees. The grown-ups were indoors, laughing and talking. Ethan suddenly turned to us, his eyes gleaming with a sly look. "Hey, what if we camped out tonight?" he suggested. Lily raised an eyebrow. "You know, Grandma and Grandpa would never let us do that. They've told us so many times. No going into the woods after dark." Ethan grinned. "Exactly. That's why we won't tell them." Kyle looked nervous. "But what if we get caught?" he asked. I felt torn. A nighttime adventure sounded thrilling, but breaking the rules didn't feel quite right. "Maybe we should just ask first," I suggested, but Ethan shook his head. "They'll say no for sure. Come on, it'll be fun. We'll be back before they even know." Lily turned to me. "What do you think, Sam?" she asked. I hesitated, but the idea of a night out with my cousins was tempting. Finally, I gave in and Kyle sighed. "Fine, but if we get in trouble, it's all on you, Ethan." We waited until the house was quiet and everyone was asleep. Around midnight, we slipped out the back, taking only a few things with us. The forest, usually familiar, looked different at night. The moon cast an eerie glow, and the shadows felt alive as we walked along the narrow path. After about 20 minutes, we found a small clearing by a creek where we often played during the day. We set up our tent by the creek, though putting it together in the dark was a challenge. But once it was up, we settled down with our small battery lantern. The sounds of crickets and the occasional owl gave the place an almost magical feel. "Who's got a good story?" Ethan asked, rubbing his hands together. Lily smirked. "I do. Ever heard of the Raven Stealer?" Kyle shivered. "I hate that one." "Too bad," she teased. "It's about a spirit that takes the hearts of the sick to add years to its own life. It can appear as a bird or even as a person, but only medicine men can see it." "That's creepy," I admitted. Ethan leaned in with a grin. "Ever heard of the Dear Lady?" Lily rolled her eyes. "That's just a story to keep kids from running off." "Maybe," he said. "But people say she appears as a beautiful woman to lure people away, then changes. Her feet are hooves, and her face turns into a deer's." Kyle hugged his knees. "Can we talk about something else?" he asked. I tried to change the mood. "What about the star people?" I said. "They say they came from the skies to teach wisdom to our ancestors." Ethan scoffed. "That's not scary." "Exactly," I said. "Maybe we've had enough scary stories for one night." But Ethan wasn't done. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Grandpa told me something once," he said. "Something he swears really happened." Lily looked wary. "What are you talking about?" Ethan took a deep breath. "When he was our age, he saw a shapeshifter. We all knew about these witches who used dark magic to turn into animals. It's not something people talk about lightly." "Ethan, maybe we shouldn't talk about this," Lily whispered, but he continued. "Grandpa said he was helping his father gather wood late one night. They got separated, and suddenly he saw a coyote standing on two legs, staring at him. Grandpa thought he was seeing things, but it started to walk toward him. its body twisting and changing shape. "Stop," Lily pleaded, but Ethan pressed on. He froze, too scared to run. The coyote had a face, a human face stretched over its skull. It whispered his name, but the voice wasn't human. A heavy silence fell over us. The forest seemed to hold its breath. I shivered. "Why would you tell that story?" Lily snapped, visibly upset. "It's just a tale," Ethan said, though he looked unsettled. Kyle looked terrified. "Do you think they're real?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," I replied, unsure. Part of me wanted to brush it off, but a part of me remembered the warnings. Maybe we should just go to sleep. We crawled into the tent, feeling a bit safer together. I lay there, listening to the sounds outside, every rustle making my heart race. Hours passed. I glanced at my watch. 3:15 a.m. Just as I was dozing off, I heard it. A soft shuffling, like footsteps dragging through the brush. I held my breath, listening hard. Then I heard it again, closer this time. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Lily turned toward me, and Ethan hissed, "Sure, listen." The shuffling grew louder, followed by a faint, raspy breathing. Kyle sat up, wide-eyed. "What is that?" he mouthed. Ethan reached for his flashlight, hands trembling. He unzipped a small part of the tent flap, just enough to see outside. We huddled around him, peering out. His flashlight cut through the dark, illuminating the trees. At first, we saw nothing, but then movement. A figure stepped out from behind a tree. It had the body of a coyote, but its limbs were too long, its fur patchy, its skin stretched over bone. The head was the worst part. It looked like a human face had been pulled over the coyote's skull. It moved in jerky, unnatural steps, circling our camp, wheezing with every breath. It didn't seem to notice us, but it was searching, its head jerking from side to side. Lily covered her mouth to keep from screaming. Kyle clutched my arm, his nails digging in. Ethan lowered the tent flap and shut off the flashlight. "What do we do?" I whispered. "Stay quiet," Ethan replied. "Maybe it'll go away." We sat in silence, listening as the creature moved around us. After what felt like forever, it seemed to grow closer. Then we heard it. "Help me," a voice whispered, raspy and broken. It was trying to speak like a person but sounded wrong. "Help me," it repeated. Kyle started to cry softly. Lily held his hand, tears in her own eyes. "Don't respond," Ethan mouthed. We stayed still as the creature pressed against the tent. The smell was overpowering, like rot and sulfur. "Why won't you help me?" it rasped. I squeezed my eyes shut, silently praying for it to leave. The wheezing continued for ages, but eventually, it faded. When the forest sounds returned, we still didn't dare move. The first light of dawn finally broke, and we felt a wave of relief. We quickly packed up, not bothering to fold anything, and left the tent behind. When we made it back to the house, our grandparents were waiting, their faces a mix of anger and worry. "Where have you been?" Grandma demanded. We went camping," Ethan said, looking down. "After we told you not to?" Grandpa's voice was stern. Lily stepped forward. "We're sorry. We thought it'd be an adventure." They let us inside, and once we were seated, Grandpa looked at each of us. "Did anything happen out there?" he asked. I looked at the others, then nodded. "Yes, sir. We saw something." Grandpa's face grew serious as we described the creature. When we finished, he sighed, nodding slowly. "As I feared," he said. "Was it a shapeshifter?" Kyle asked, barely audible. Grandpa frowned. "Don't speak of it," he said. "Yes, and that's all I'll say." Our parents performed a cleansing ceremony that afternoon. The house was filled with the scent of sage, and we felt safer. We were grounded for the rest of the summer, which was just fine with me. None of us wanted to go back to the woods anytime soon. On my last night, Grandpa joined me on the porch. "You've learned a tough lesson," he said. "The spirits here are powerful. Some are good, others aren't. Remember to respect them and the wisdom passed down through the years." As I went back to the city, that experience stayed with me. I still think of it, especially at night. It's a reminder of the mysteries we don't fully understand, and the importance of listening to those who came before us. Some things are beyond explaining, and maybe that's for the best. Last year, my friend Tara and I decided on a little getaway to Italy. We had both just finished university and wanted to do something exciting before starting our careers. We'd saved up some cash from part-time work and planned a 2-week backpacking trip through the Italian countryside. Naturally, we started in Rome, taking in the major sites like the Colosseum and the Vatican, but both of us were more interested in exploring off the beaten path. So, we made our way south to more rural areas, eager to experience what we called the real Italy. One area that caught our eye was the region of Reggiano. Tara had read about it in a historical thriller and was fascinated by the tale of the creature of Reggiano, a beast that supposedly terrorized the region centuries ago. I'm a bit of a history nerd, so I was on board. We arrived in a quaint village called Montella, nestled among the hills. It was charming, with cobblestone streets and old stone buildings. The locals were friendly but a bit guarded when we brought up the creature's legend. An older woman even muttered something under her breath and made the sign of the cross when we mentioned it. Undeterred, we checked into a quiet little inn, planning to explore the nearby forests the following day. The innkeeper, a middle-aged man named Leo, warned us to stay on the marked paths. "People get lost easily," he said in his thick accent, "and wolves have been more active recently." "Wolves?" Tara asked, looking intrigued. "Yes, but they rarely approach humans," he replied. "Just be careful." The next morning, we loaded our backpacks and set out. The forest was breathtaking, with tall trees forming a canopy overhead and the fresh scent of pine. Birds chirped around us, and it was exactly the peaceful escape we had been hoping for. About 2 hours into our hike, we spotted an overgrown trail that wasn't marked on our map. Ever the adventurous one, Tara thought we should check it out. "Come on, Mia," she said, tugging at my arm. "This is exactly the kind of adventure we wanted." I hesitated. Leo said to stick to the main trails. She laughed, rolling her eyes. "Are you really afraid of an old legend?" I grinned. "All right, but if we get lost, it's your fault." We ventured down the path, which led us deeper into the woods. The trees grew denser, and the light filtering through gave everything a strange green glow. It was eerie yet beautiful. After an hour, we came upon a clearing with the ruins of an old stone cottage, its walls covered in moss, nearly reclaimed by nature. "Imagine who might have lived here," Tara said, brushing her hand over the worn stone. As we explored, I noticed strange symbols carved into one of the walls. They weren't like anything I'd seen, more like ancient signs than letters. "Check this out," I called. Tara came over, studying the symbols. "Weird. Maybe it's an old dialect." Just then, we heard a rustling noise in the trees. We froze. "Maybe it's just an animal," I whispered, trying to reassure us both. "Maybe we should head back," Tara said, her boldness fading. I agreed. As we turned, I caught a glimpse of something large and dark moving between the trees. It was too big to be a deer. "Did you see that?" I asked, my heart pounding. "See what?" "I don't know. Something moved over there." We stood still, straining to see, but the woods had gone eerily silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. "Let's go," Tara whispered. We started walking back quickly, resisting the urge to run. Every so often, I'd hear a twig snap or leaves rustling, but each time I looked back, there was nothing there. Eventually, we realized we weren't on the same trail we had taken before. "Are we lost?" I asked, trying to keep calm. "The path should be right here," Tara muttered, looking around anxiously. Our map was useless, and our phones had no signal under the thick canopy. "Let's just retrace our steps," I suggested. Just then, a low growl echoed through the trees. Tara tried to joke, asking if it was my stomach, but her voice shook. We picked up our pace. The growling grew louder, closer. Then Tara let out a scream, and I turned to see a massive animal emerge from the shadows. It looked like a wolf but was far too large, with matted fur and yellow eyes that seemed to glow. Its snout was elongated, saliva dripping from its fangs. "Run!" I yelled. We sprinted, branches whipping at our faces as the creature crashed through the underbrush behind us. My lungs burned, but adrenaline kept me moving. Suddenly, Tara tripped on a root and fell. I skidded to a stop, helping her up. "Come on," I urged as the beast closed in, snarling. We spotted a rocky incline and scrambled up, hoping it wouldn't follow. At the top, we found ourselves on another path, a marked trail this time. Relief washed over me as I spotted a sign pointing the way back to the village. But before we could catch our breath, the creature appeared below, watching us with those same menacing eyes. It let out a howl that echoed through the trees. "Go!" Tara yelled. We ran down the trail, not stopping until we broke out of the woods and stumbled onto a road, where a small van was parked. An older man, loading crates, looked up, startled as we raced toward him. "Please help us," I gasped. He took one look at us and motioned for us to get in. Without hesitation, we climbed in, and he sped toward the village. "What happened?" he asked in broken English. "Something chased us," Tara said, breathless. He nodded grimly. "The creature. You know about it?" I asked. He didn't answer, but the silence was enough. Back in Montella, we returned to the inn. Leo gave us a knowing look. "You went off the trails, didn't you?" "We're sorry," I said, "but we saw something impossible." Leo sighed. "It's not just a story. Many here have seen it." "Why doesn't anyone do anything?" Tara demanded. He shrugged. "It's a curse that has plagued this place for centuries." That night, we stayed locked in our room, barely sleeping. The next morning, we decided to cut our trip short and return to Rome. As we left, Leo handed us a small charm with an intricate design. "What's this?" I asked. "A protective charm," he said, "for safety." We thanked him and left, eager to put the forest behind us. Back in Rome, the city's busy streets made the whole experience feel like a strange memory. Yet I still have nightmares of those yellow eyes and that growl. Tara and I rarely bring it up. When people ask about our trip, we stick to the usual stories: the Colosseum, the food, the museums. No one would believe us anyway. But sometimes, I wonder what else is out there, hidden in remote places that people are too afraid to talk about. And I can't shake the feeling that we were fortunate to make it out of Reggiano alive. One fall, it was a usual thing for my dad to pick up my brothers and me after school, then head to the mountains for an afternoon of gathering firewood. Dad would chop down the trees and saw them into sections, while my brothers and I rolled the wood to the truck and loaded it up. We'd repeat this assembly line until the truck was full, usually before it got dark. After a long, sweaty day, we'd all pile into the truck, exhausted, and make our way back down the mountain. The following day, we'd unload, split, and stack the wood into neat rows. We'd go through this routine until we had enough firewood for the winter for our house, Grandma's cabin, and extra for some of our elderly neighbors. On one particular afternoon, we decided to try a different logging road on the opposite side of the valley, beyond our usual wood gathering area. My dad wanted a change of scenery, he said, though we had no specific reason for the switch. This logging road hadn't been maintained in a while. Large rocks and fallen branches littered the path. My brothers and I had to walk ahead, pushing aside stones and debris while Dad carefully maneuvered the truck up the twisting mountain road, inch by inch. The climb was grueling, and as we got higher into the dense woods, I began feeling uneasy. I couldn't tell if it was just from the tough hike or something else, but there was a strange charge in the air, like the mountain itself was humming at a level just below what I could sense. It felt like the mountain was aware of our presence and didn't exactly welcome us. Before I could say anything, my younger brother asked, "Does anyone else feel like we shouldn't be here?" My older brother and I stopped and turned to look at him, both nodding. Our silent agreement was broken by Dad honking and motioning us to keep clearing the path. Reluctantly, we kept moving to a small clearing in the woods, where we finally stopped the truck. My dad, either unaware of or ignoring our unease, got his saw and went straight to work. As the wood was cut down and loaded, I couldn't shake the dark, heavy feelings settling over me. I noticed my brothers also glancing over their shoulders now and then, as though they felt it too. Except for Dad, we all seemed on edge. As the sun started to dip below the trees, the sky dimmed, and the uneasy tension only grew stronger. Finally, Dad surprised us by saying we should load up and head home. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, and I could see the tension ease from my brothers' faces too. Oddly, the truck was only half loaded, which was unusual. Dad would usually keep working until dark to make sure the truck was full, but tonight he seemed eager to leave. With our half load, we started down the mountain. Though we were tired, everyone seemed more relaxed. We were chatting, joking, trying to shake off the eerie mood from earlier. As we neared the edge of the trees, heading down a switchback, a brown shape suddenly leapt out from the slope beside us. All Dad could do was shout as he slammed on the brakes. The truck, loaded with wood and moving downhill, couldn't avoid colliding with the figure. We stopped, staring out the windshield in silence. In the glow of the headlights was a crumpled deer. Dad got out, muttering to check on things, telling my brothers to stay put. I didn't listen, hopping out and following behind him. The truck seemed fine, just some fur and blood on the grill. Deer were common here, and hitting one wasn't out of the ordinary. But this deer had dropped instantly. At higher speeds, they usually run off after a hit, bolting into the woods on an adrenaline rush. But this one lay crumpled like it had been dead long before we hit it. As we got closer, a thick, foul stench hit us. Deer don't smell good alive, but this was another level, like rot and decay. My stomach turned, and my nose burned from the stench. When we finally got close, I could see it was completely dead. My eyes watered from the stench. Its eyes were gone, replaced by hollow, sunken spaces, and its tongue was black and swollen, hanging out of its mouth. Its stomach was split open, with entrails spilled onto the ground, and under the dim headlights, it looked like its fur and guts were moving, writhing almost. Leaning in, I saw that it was covered in maggots, inside and out. The deer had been dead for days, maybe weeks. Backing away, my stomach lurched. That odd, tense feeling rushed back in. Dad, usually calm and silent, looked visibly horrified in the dim headlights. He wasn't focused on the deer, though. His eyes were fixed down the mountain. His voice was steady but with a hint of fear as he told me to get back to the truck. I quickly obeyed, grabbing the door handle. At that moment, a loud, high-pitched scream echoed through the trees, accompanied by snapping branches. Something was coming up the slope fast. I jumped into the truck, and Dad, not even waiting to close his door fully, hit the gas, sending us lurching forward, running over the deer as we raced down the mountain. With all of us shouting, It was hard to tell if the shrieking was following us or not. But once we broke out of the trees into the valley, everything went quiet except for the truck engine and the wind blowing in through the windows. When we got home, Dad finally parked, and we all just sat in the truck, stunned, no one wanting to get out. Then we all started talking at once, asking questions. Dad shook his head and quieted us. He explained that he'd felt uneasy all day but hadn't wanted to worry us. He described it as being in a stranger's house without permission. As dusk fell, he noticed shadows in the woods, catching glimpses of figures darting between trees. He didn't get a good look, but the movement was enough to make his stomach sink. He decided to leave as soon as possible. After hitting the deer and realizing it was long dead, Dad figured out what was happening. He said something had thrown the deer to get us to stop. And that scream? It wasn't meant for us to hear. He had heard sounds in the dark just beyond the path, like something waiting. It was a trap, he realized. We could have triggered something far worse if we hadn't left when we did. We didn't go back for firewood for the rest of the season. Dad bought what we needed. The next year, we returned to gathering wood, but we never set foot on that mountain again. The Forest Service later closed and reclaimed that road, and the only way back up there now is on foot. None of us are eager to go back. Whatever was there, whatever threw that dead deer, it didn't want us up there. It wanted us gone or worse. Growing up on a farm with over 200 acres to roam had its upsides. Plenty of space, a sense of peace, and all the freedom you could want. By age 18, I was used to helping my dad with all kinds of work around the place. He ran it with a steady hand, and I pitched in wherever I could. One warm evening, Dad mentioned needing some old trees cleared out deep in the woods. He even offered extra pay for the job, more than he'd usually give, which was enticing since I was saving for an old dirt bike a buddy was selling. The next morning, I loaded up the truck with the gear I needed, using Dad's sturdy trailer to carry it all. The area he wanted cleared was in the least traveled parts of our land, a good drive away. The sun was still setting as I drove, casting everything in a golden light. It took about 30 minutes, with the path getting narrower and more overgrown as I went. When I reached the spot, I took a moment to soak in the quiet. Tall trees towered all around, and the wind had that calm, whispering sound. I started up the chainsaw, and the first few trees came down easily. But as I moved to the next, I got the strange feeling I was being watched. I paused, turned off the saw, and listened. All I heard was the usual sounds of the woods, so I shrugged it off and got back to work. After a couple of hours, while taking a break, I noticed something odd. One of the trees I had just felled was gone. It seemed impossible. Trees don't just disappear. I walked over to check, and sure enough, the stump was there, cleanly cut, but the tree was missing. Puzzled, I looked around, but it was nowhere to be seen. Dismissing it as an oversight, I went on with my tasks. As the day wore on, I felt increasingly uneasy. Shadows seemed to flicker just beyond my line of sight, and at one point, I thought I heard faint laughter. The feeling of being watched returned, more intense than before, but every time I checked, I was alone. By nightfall, after a quick meal, I called my mom to let her know I'd stay out here for the night, not wanting to drive back in the dark. She told me to stay safe and call if I needed anything. With my tent set up, I made a small fire to cook some dinner, just some canned food and hot dogs, but it hit the spot. As I sat by the fire, reading a book my dad had lent me about local history, I began to notice noises in the trees. It sounded like footsteps crunching on dry leaves, just beyond the fire's light. I assumed it was a passing animal, but couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. It was a struggle, but eventually, I lay down to sleep, thinking I was just on edge from being out there alone. Sometime later, a loud thump jolted me awake. I listened closely and could hear something breathing heavily, irregularly. Carefully, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The moonlight cast eerie shadows over everything, and I spotted a figure slipping behind a tree, too large to be any animal I knew. My breath caught. I turned on my flashlight and scanned the trees, but every time the light passed, I just barely caught sight of a tall, thin shape ducking out of view. It seemed to know where I'd look and managed to stay hidden. Finally, I convinced myself I needed to leave. I gathered my things, quietly crept to the truck, and started the engine. But with the loaded trailer, it was tough to maneuver on the rough path. I quickly decided to unhook it and heard a low growl behind me as I did. Too terrified to look, I jumped back in the truck, floored it, and sped back to the farmhouse. I didn't slow down until I saw the lights of home. The next morning, I returned with Dad to get the trailer. Everything looked normal in the daylight, and we hitched it back up without trouble. I glanced back as we were leaving and thought I saw a dark shape slip behind a tree, but I couldn't be sure. Back home, I searched through a book on folklore and found an entry on a creature called the Hide Behind. Supposedly, it preyed on people alone in the woods, lurking just out of sight. The resemblance to my experience was too strong to ignore. I shared some of the story with Dad in passing, and he said, "Your grandpa used to talk about strange things in the woods too." From then on, I avoided going deep into the forest alone. Even now, the woods feel different. Quiet, yes, but also a place to be careful around. As a kid, I grew up in a really unusual spot deep in the woods. To this day, I'm unsure what kind of encounter I had. It could have been some kind of spirit or something else entirely. I'm hoping someone can shed some light on what my friend and I experienced that evening. I was around 13 and my friend, let's call him Chris, was about 11. Chris's dad had bought a large forested area about 60 miles from our city in Ontario, Canada. It was pure wilderness when his family got it, but they cleared a spot to build their house. The rest remained untouched, thick woods. A dirt road divided their land into two sections. On the right side, where their house was, the forest felt open and calm with gentle hills, a pleasant place to hang out. The left side was completely different. There was a deep ditch, maybe 6 feet down, followed by a steep hill covered in moss. Beyond the hill, the woods felt dark and ominous, with tall, shadowy pines. It was as if the forest gave off a warning. We joked around, calling that side the Haunted Woods. One fall day, maybe around 2000 or 2001, my family visited Chris's. While the adults were busy, Chris and I decided to explore the woods. Chris's dad warned us about a stray animal that had been getting into their trash. He thought it looked like a Rottweiler or some other big dog and didn't seem well. Patches of fur were missing, and it looked sick. He told us not to approach it if we saw it. The day was calm, cloudy, and windless. Leaves were turning orange and gold, and many had fallen, blanketing the ground. Chris and I walked along the dirt road, with the friendly woods on our right and the haunted woods on our left. We were slightly creeped out by the haunted woods, as usual, but we decided to be brave and tried not to think about it. Eventually, I noticed something odd. On the steep hill to our left, someone had tied a pink ribbon to a low-hanging pine branch. The ribbon was flapping wildly, almost horizontal, as if there were strong winds, but it was completely still that day. I touched the ribbon and even checked for wind the way my dad taught me by wetting my finger. Nothing. I mentioned it to Chris, but he seemed distracted, so we continued on. We reached a point where the hill had a gentler slope, almost like it had been hollowed out, giving us a clear view of the hillside. Chris got excited, thinking he heard something in the haunted woods. He explained there were wildcats in the area, and he thought he heard one. He wanted to try calling it to see if it might come down to us. I wasn't thrilled about the idea of calling out into that creepy forest, but before I could say anything, Chris started loudly meowing. To my shock, something in the forest meowed back. Chris was thrilled and kept meowing, and each time, the forest answered. The sound wasn't echoing, it was responding. As Chris continued, I started to feel uneasy. The rustling of leaves began moving closer, but there was nothing visible. "Look," Chris said. "It's coming towards us." Sure enough, we could hear something moving, as if walking on two legs, but we saw nothing. My nerves were screaming at me that something was wrong. The sounds got louder, coming from different directions, but still we saw nothing. Chris was mad at me for suggesting we leave, saying the kittens were coming to play with us. Suddenly, right by my feet, I heard heavy panting, like a big dog was right there. But when I looked down, there was nothing. I spun around, terrified, but saw no one near us. Then, up the dirt road, maybe 300 feet away, I spotted a lone dog. It resembled a Rottweiler, but it looked terrible, scruffy, with fur missing in patches and skin exposed. It was watching us, but there was no way I could hear it panting from that far. Yet the sound was right at my feet. My fear finally overtook me, and I bolted downhill, Chris racing alongside me, both of us terrified. We made it back safely, and after that, we avoided those woods. One spring break, my buddies and I decided to go on a camping trip. We had set everything up about a week ahead of time, but as the date approached, the weather just kept getting worse. It was unseasonably cold and gloomy, which was strange for Mississippi. When the night finally arrived, it brought another chilly front. I was in my late 20s, so we bundled up and packed some bourbon and a few beers. Our plan was to camp out at a spot my friend was familiar with, accessible only with his 4x4. We wanted a real camping experience, not some designated family campsite, so we aimed to get far from any signs of civilization. The town we left behind was small, just a stop sign and a few hundred people, and then we headed straight into the woods. After about a half hour of rattling around over dried creek beds and weaving around fallen trees, it began to rain. By the time we found our camping spot, the rain had turned to hail. The place was marked by a rundown dirt path a few hundred feet long and the skeleton of an old VW bug. That night, we passed around a bottle and attempted to set up our tents before getting too tipsy. Eventually, we managed to get the tents up and started a fire with some diesel. By then, the hail had stopped, and the empty bourbon bottle lay cracked in the flames. We were gathering a fair pile of empties as we kept drinking, played cards, and eventually dozed off in our tents. The next morning, I slowly woke to the sound of something large being dragged past my tent. It looked like a rusted station wagon hauling the old VW with a chain. That VW had sat there for so long its floor had decayed, and roots held it to the forest floor. Following the wagon's trail, bits of dirt and brush scattered behind it. Inside the station wagon was a woman driving, a man sitting beside her, and 3 shirtless kids in the back where the seats used to be. The man looked out the window, completely ignoring us, while the children, with dirt smeared on their faces, stared blankly, their eyes hollow and far away. It was the kind of deep poverty you see only in certain areas, in the roughest inner-city neighborhoods or remote places like this. The woman spoke in a voice rough from years of smoking and drinking. "You boys from the city, come out here to camp? Well, that's fine as long as you ain't here to do any drugs." "Y'all ain't doing any drugs, are ya?" We shook our heads, saying we were just drinking. "Well, that's all right," she said. "I have a drink here and there myself." She leaned in closer. "Wanna know how I knew y'all were out here? Seen them black helicopters flying round. Got some people working for me, you see. This here's my land. They told me someone was out here. Figured I'd better come check on things." She started laughing. "A wet, raspy laugh that didn't quite match the dry tone she'd been using. The man kept looking out at nothing, and one of the kids put both hands on the window, peering through us. He looked about 8 or 9, his mouth slightly open, and a line of spit traced down the dirt-covered glass. "Y'all know Katie?" she asked. We didn't. "Well, everyone knows Katie around here. Y'all go to church." I lied and said we did. "Good. Don't got time for those who don't fear God. Why don't you come up to the church tomorrow? Meet Katie. It's just over that hill there. Can't miss it. She'd love to meet you all." Everyone would. We quickly assured her that we'd show up, and she drove off slowly, hauling the VW into the trees. As soon as she was out of sight, we exchanged nervous laughs. It was just nerves. There wasn't anything funny about it. We all have a basic ancient sense for danger that can stir up every so often, and when it does, you listen. There was something wrong. I felt it even before she spoke, just by looking into her eyes. Something was off: the kids, the man, her laughter. We eventually did hike up that hill. We could see for miles, but there was nothing. No buildings, no clearings, just endless forest. We packed up and cut the trip short, heading out before noon.